This is a 97.5 The Fanatic production. Birds Buzz with Andrew DiCecco. News, analysis, insight, and conversation from your trusted Birds insider starts right now.
Hey, what's happening, everybody? Welcome into another edition of Birds Buzz, hosted by yours truly, Andrew DiCecco, Birds insider here for 97.5 The Fanatic, and Eagles beat reporter for InsideTheBirds.com. There's a lot going on in Eagles land. They've returned after an extended layoff. They had the bye week, coming back well rested. In fact, on Thursday, I've had to get my days configured here because everything moves forward today with the Eagles playing on Monday Night Football. Cam Jurgens was the only player who did not practice, and that's always subject to change. But the first day back, it was Cam Jurgens who was sidelined once again with the knee, something to keep an eye on. That could mean, if this trends in this direction, that Brett Toth makes his second career start at center. I'll be monitoring that throughout the week. And returning to practice, A.J. Brown, who, of course, did not play in the game against the Giants. He had the hamstring injury. He was back out there on Thursday. And Saquon Barkley with the groin, that's another one. The Eagles also opened the 21-day practice window earlier this week for edge rusher Nolan Smith. So there is a chance, depending on how he looks in practice, and there's other factors that contribute to it, that he could be available for Monday Night Football, adding to some of the other new faces at that position that we're going to get into. But the Eagles, for this late in the season, are pretty well. They're pretty healthy at this stage, which is really rare. If you look across the NFL, they're pretty fortunate, and that's sort of the health status situation. But I don't want to bury the lead. The Eagles added 3 players leading up to the NFL trade deadline: cornerback Michael Carter, cornerback Jaire Alexander, and edge rusher Jaelan Phillips. Let's get into what all 3 bring to the table, what they could potentially add, and where they sort of slot in terms of fitting in on the defensive side of the ball. Okay, so Michael Carter, he comes over from the New York Jets. He was the Eagles' first addition. That was dating back to last Wednesday. And he has familiarity with Joe Douglas, who was the GM with the Jets at the time when he was there. He's, of course, with the Philadelphia Eagles right now in a different capacity. And he also overlapped at Duke with Eagles safeties coach Joe Casper. So Joe Casper was a defensive assistant for 2 seasons there at Duke, and that familiarity likely helped bring Michael Carter over to Philadelphia. So the way that I view this addition is along the lines of Avonte Maddox and how he was utilized here in Philadelphia, being that primarily a nickel defender, but also offering safety versatility, which is important, especially knowing that the Eagles placed safety Marcus Epps on injured reserve the same day. So last Saturday now, when they signed Jaire Alexander. So he adds some depth there at safety and at nickel. And on its face, it's easy to look at that and say, does that mean that Cooper DeJean is going to finally move outside? Not necessarily. It's one of the luxuries of adding a nickel player who's played at a high level. He was once the highest paid nickel defender in the NFL. His play has trailed off since then. But I think adding someone like that with flexibility, it arms Vic Fangio with optionality in how he chooses to deploy him. And there may be some matchups where the Eagles move Cooper DeJean outside. Remember, Cooper DeJean is playing outside when the Eagles are in base already. But certain circumstances could present themselves where he's now moving out there in certain matchups if those matchups dictate it. And that's sort of the luxury of adding a player like that. Now, he's going to have to get up to speed. Nickel is one of the most challenging positions to play in the NFL, certainly in a Vic Fangio defense. There's a lot of complexities there that he's going to have to master, but I kind of like that move, if not for any other reason that it adds depth and optionality. So Jaire Alexander is an interesting one because this is a player who was one of my favorite corners to watch, and those who have followed along with my work, you know that I kind of have an affinity for defensive backs, scouting defensive backs, evaluating defensive backs, and they're fun to watch on the field. How they match up with certain wide receivers, they're always the chattiest bunch on the field. And I found that a lot of my most compelling interviews have been a byproduct of talking to defensive backs and understanding, sort of their process and how they go about preparing for certain matchups and what makes them tick. And it's such a challenging position, especially in a pass-happy league. But Jaire Alexander was a player that I really enjoyed watching, especially during his heyday with the Green Bay Packers. He's a two-time All-Pro, two-time Pro Bowler. Now, he is some years removed from that. You have to go all the way back to 2022 when he was exceptional and even playing at a relatively high degree. Then injuries, particularly a knee injury, have sort of derailed him, and he's only 28 years old, so it's kind of you lose sight of that when you look at the way that his career has gone since leaving the Packers. And he was signed to the Baltimore Ravens in June, and I know at the time that was a name that when you see it floating out there, he is a household name, and you can't help but wonder if the Eagles would have any interest. Well, the Ravens seemingly make a savvy move. They bring him in there, and it seems like he's going to provide a reinforcement to their secondary. Now, it didn't pan out that way. He played in just 2 games. He was inactive for 5 games, a healthy scratch for 5 games. So you look at it and you wonder why he wasn't able to contribute to the, one of the worst defenses in the NFL. There was one game where they were down 3 corners and Jaire Alexander couldn't contribute. Now, Jaire Alexander, when he met with us on Thursday, he mentioned that it was a case in which the Ravens wanted to give some other guys opportunities. He feels healthy. He said he feels better than he's ever been, which is great to hear. He's also a Philadelphia native. He was born in Jefferson Hospital. He said his mother is an Eagles fan still to this day, and she was smiling from ear to ear when he got traded. And he grew up an Eagles fan. He was rattling off a lot of different defensive players, especially even Lito Shepherd. He was talking about Brian Dawkins, Jeremiah Trotter. So he's very well versed in the Eagles' history, and he should be a seamless fit. He said that when he was asked about A.J. Brown, we all know how that matchup went in Week 1 when their Eagles were in Brazil. And A.J. Brown, when asked, he said, "Oh, that's my son." And he laughed, and he goes, and then Jaire said that when he went up to him, he gave him a big hug and said, "We're not in Brazil anymore." So there's a mutual respect there from both players. Jaire Alexander is on the right side of things now, I guess, because the Eagles have gotten the better of the Packers in recent history, and he gets a chance to go back. His first game as an Eagle, potentially, if he's active, to go and play against the team that drafted him in the first round back in 2018. But there's a lot of questions about how he's going to fit. What does he have left? Well, it's impossible to make any sort of conclusions or determinations until you see him on the field, until you see him in game action. But on the surface, the data that we have to go off of, it's fair to have questions. But I got to tell you, I was very impressed with his introductory press conference and the scrum outside of his locker. This is someone who is looking at this as another opportunity to go out there. He has the connection with Eagles defensive backs coach Christian Parker. He said that, he's been meeting with, as he referred to him as CP, about 5 times a day since he got there. So there is an outside chance that you could see Jaire Alexander available Monday night when the Eagles go to Lambeau Field. I'm curious to see how this all transpires. In my estimation, I believe that it would be Kelee Ringo who gets the start Monday night while Alexander continues to fine-tune some things and get up to speed with the defense. It's not an easy defense to learn, especially when you're out there on an island and you have some responsibilities that you need to be mindful of, communication and all those different types of pieces. But down the line, I could see a world where Jaire Alexander is the starter. But we'll have to wait and see. Kelee Ringo has performed relatively well in that half against the Vikings, and then he went in against the Giants. Now, he wasn't targeted all that much, but he's someone that you can sort of see stacking productive days or games, I should say. And I think that goes a long way within the psyche of a player, that once you start to see positive things happen, you play faster. You're playing with more confidence. You're trusting your technique. Now, he needs to be more instinctual. He has to make plays on the football when the ball does come his way and continue to prove himself to Vic Fangio that he deserves to stay out there. But I think that this cornerback situation is so interesting because now you have Jaire Alexander added to the mix. Jacorian Bennett, his 21-day practice window has been open since October 22nd, but he hasn't been activated to the 53-man roster. And he's sort of a mystery box because you don't really know what he can provide. He's played just 24 snaps this season. And even Vic Fangio himself graded him as incomplete when asked because he hasn't seen enough of him. Then you have Adoree Jackson and you have Kelee Ringo. So there's a lot of names here, and this kind of leads into my one of the segments that I want to do later in this program. But I wonder how this is all going to shake out. But I think in the immediate future, at least in the short term, it'll be Kelee Ringo, and we'll see how short that leash ultimately is. But I think the Eagles have an idea of who Kelee Ringo is, but he does know the defense. And Adoree Jackson, I should also mention, was listed as limited the first day returning from the bye week with the concussion, and so was Moro Ojomo. So we'll see. And I think that Jacorian Bennett could be a name to keep an eye on because the Eagles probably don't even know what they have yet, and they may want to get a better assessment there to be able to land on a corner because the last thing that this team wants to do down the stretch is sort of toggle between multiple players, whether it's Adoree Jackson, Kelee Ringo, Jacorian Bennett, or Jaire Alexander. You want to land on one and provide some stability, and you're able to establish that continuity and communication with the back-end pieces there. But I think of all the trade additions, the one that I'm most curious to see is Jaire Alexander because was it a byproduct of him simply not being a scheme fit there? It doesn't seem like health was an issue, but not every destination is an opportune one for every player. Maybe getting back together with Christian Parker, who was a defensive quality control coach for 2 seasons at Green Bay, so he overlapped with Jaire there. Maybe that sort of rekindles something in his game and they're able to unlock the player that he was, or even some semblance, I should say. Who knows? We're going to find out. But I think because of all the things that I mentioned, that's why I find this edition to be the most interesting to see how everything transpires. But I was very impressed with his introductory press conference, and I think the Eagles are getting a hungry player who is looking at this as a fresh start. He's still young at 28. He knows what he's able to do out there, and I think he's going to go out there with a chip on his shoulder looking to prove himself in a new spot. The final one is Jaelan Phillips, and Jaelan Phillips was the big splash, right? It was Monday morning. You get the notification that the Eagles were trading for him. It was the worst-kept secret in the NFL. That has been something that you've heard his name tied to the Eagles or as a player of interest. And it makes sense when you look at everything in the sense that he was a player who played for Vic Fangio in 2023. The Dolphins just changed their GMs. They're a team in flux right now. They're not in position to win anything. They were offloading. If anything, they were in position to offload assets and try to rebuild and get things headed in the right direction. So that's why I looked at Jaelan Phillips and Bradley Chubb, who was there, as 2 logical options. But the Eagles get the better of the 2 players, the younger of the 2 players as well, in Jaelan Phillips. 6'5", 263 pounds. He looks every bit of that. He called joining the Philadelphia Eagles as probably one of the best things to ever happen to him. And you got the sense that he was eager to start this chapter of his career here in Philadelphia. He looked at it as a pivotal point in his life and career. Mentioned he has a baby on the way. Also noted that it's a contract year. And how receptive and in welcoming the Philadelphia fans were to him, and that he's gotten about 20 more likes on his post on Instagram than he's gotten. So he said, shout out to the Philadelphia fans. He mentioned playing under Vic Fangio in Miami and that it was simplistic, but it was aggressive, and that's where he feels that he's at his best. And that he also likes Vic as a person, that he's very straightforward. And, you know, he's a no-nonsense type of guy, and that's really, he said that really resonates with him. He said he's a man of few words, so he didn't have a ton of extensive conversations with Vic since coming to the Philadelphia Eagles, but they understand each other. He also added that, you know, there is going to be an adjustment. He's been almost 2 years removed since playing in that system, so it may not be a seamless transition, but he's working diligently to get acquainted with his teammates and the playbook, and that's something to keep in mind. I do believe that he'll be in the mix Monday night against the Packers because, let's face it, the Eagles only have 9 regular season games with him and then whatever the postseason entails, so you want to get the most out of him while you can. They gave up a third-round pick to get him. He does count in the compensatory formula, and I think this is a player that's going to immediately headline this group. He can play the run. He can rush the passer. 3 sacks this season. He's played a tick over 400 snaps. Injuries have been the big hiccup for him. He had the Achilles injury in 2023, which limited him to 8 games. And then he had the ACL in 24, which shortened his season to just 4 games. But Howie Roseman, when he spoke after the trade deadline, he noted that the Achilles injury happened on the MetLife Stadium turf. And the ACL injury occurred when, friendly fire with a teammate. So the injury part of this is something that the Eagles obviously look closely into, which you would expect if they're willing to give up that kind of asset to bring him on. But I think that really sheds some light on the depths that the teams will go to make sure that they have all of their information and ducks in a row. So this season he's been healthy he played and started in all 9 games for the Dolphins. And under Vic Fangio, I should mention that he had 6.5 sacks and 27 pressures over those 8 games that he was available. And looking at it through the lens of Philadelphia, Jaelan Phillips mentioned that there's a lot of freedom up front. There's the ability to pin your ears back and have that aggressive rushing mindset that he really likes. Now, he's typically rushed from the left side in his career. He said that was sort of a byproduct of the system and kind of the way things worked out. He said he loves rushing from the left side, but he'll do whatever the team needs him to do. So that's something to keep an eye on as well. I think this is going to be a really good addition for the Eagles. You're getting a motivated player joining a new team. It's a new opportunity. He has a contract year right in front of him. He's healthy, and he's playing with Vic Fangio. So if all those things start to align, I believe that adding someone like that to head your group, and if you get Nolan Smith back, and Brandon Graham is now part of the 53-man roster. His 2-week exemption expired Monday, so he now counts towards the 53. You're getting some reinforcements there. Graham, if nothing else, can help against the run. Jaelan Phillips is a two-way player. He's going to help them in a major way. And Nolan Smith is a player who plays extremely physical. I am very impressed with the way that he sets the edge and sets the tone, especially against the run. He just throws his body around. But now adding someone like Jaelan Phillips and even Brandon Graham to a degree, you're now alleviating a lot of the pressure from a Jalix Hunt, from a Nolan Smith when he comes back. All of the players now can see a reduction in their snaps for preservation purposes, but also to keep a healthy rotation going and keep everyone fresh. And we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves here, but normally teams will activate 4 edge rushers on game day. Well, the Eagles could have a conundrum, right? Because let's go through this here. Jaelan Phillips, Brandon Graham, Jalix Hunt, you got Josh Uche, and you could have Nolan Smith back as early as Monday night. So you don't normally see teams activate 5, but you can make an argument that they should activate 5. One, because Brandon Graham's 37 years old and you don't quite know how many snaps he can give you. But also, Josh Uche is part of the kickoff team. So he has a game day role, and I think that in his limited opportunities, he's been an effective rusher. So the Eagles suddenly have almost, at least on paper, an embarrassment of riches at that position, and it's a good problem to have. They always say it's, a good problem to have is still a problem, but I think that that's something you can make a case for having 5 players up for the reasons in which I outlined. But I'm really optimistic with that trade, and I think that that's going to help the Eagles in a tangible way as early as Monday night. And he mentioned that he loves the vibe, loves the environment, loves the weather in Philadelphia. I asked him, I said, what did you know about the city of Philadelphia, before you got here? And he said, I knew Meek Mill. I knew Little Uzi Vert's from here. He talked about the Liberty Bell. He said, aside from that, not much. But super happy to be here. That came across immediately, and he's just eager to turn the page and start this chapter of his career. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what that volume looks like in his first game with the team. So I want to pivot to some storylines that I'm going to be keeping an eye on going into the second half, the backstretch of games here for the Philadelphia Eagles. And I have a few of them here, and I'm curious to hear where you all land on this, and maybe you guys have other storylines, but feel free to email me, adechecco5@gmail.com or andrew.dicecco@bbgi.com, and I'll work that into the next podcast. But for me, the first and foremost is the running game. Was the unlocking, if you will, of the running game a byproduct of playing the Giants, or are the Eagles figuring some things out offensively? And I think it's the latter for me. I think that not only have they figured things out in the ground game, they also have a nice complement to Saquon Barkley and Tank Bigsby. So now they have a 1-2 punch that I think really play off each other well, and a healthier offensive line coming off that bye week. I thought against the Giants, Landon Dickerson was tremendous. I thought he had a really good game. Even on that 65-yard Saquon Barkley touchdown run, he blocked 3 players on that play. And then at the end there, it was Saquon Barkley versus safety Tyler Nubin one-on-one, and Saquon's going to win that all day. I also think that it mattered to have a healthy center in Brett Toth, who did a really nice job of getting out in space, the reach blocks, the pull blocks. It really played to his strengths, and he was able to get out there and really take to his assignment and help springboard that rushing attack. And then, of course, Jordan Mailata, Lane Johnson were great. Tyler Steen has been an unsung hero for the offense. Quiet producer, but he's been just fine. I know that there's some folks out there that were wondering whether or not the Eagles should bring back Mekhi Becton. Mekhi Becton, by the way, has been banged up with the Chargers there, and he's a different type of player. He would help them in the run game as a mauler. He can kind of lean on people because he's so large. But Steen does things a little bit differently, and his skill set and body type is more akin to what Jeff Stoutland typically covets in his offensive lineman, in the sense that he can move side to side. He has good lateral quickness. He can climb to the second level and do some things athletically that Mekhi Becton can't do. Now, Mekhi Becton is a tackle by trade and kicked inside the guard, but I think you see where I'm going with this. I just think Tyler Steen's been done a really solid job, and that's a player that I was really bullish on going back to the summer. So I think the Eagles are finding a sound recipe for success here. Healthy offensive line coming off the bye week, and Saquon Barkley looks to be reinvigorated, and he took what the Giants were giving him instead of trying to hit the home run. And I thought Kevin Patullo had some really nice run designs and knew when to spell Saquon Barkley. It just seemed to me like Kevin Patullo was really in a flow, in a rhythm offensively, and that's something that I think that they can certainly build on. Jordan Mailata has said multiple times this season that the Eagles were a hair off from breaking something big in the run game, and it turns out he was right. I know that there's some out there that maybe don't want to make too much off the Giants game, and you're a little cautiously optimistic, but I do think that they found something there. But that is a storyline that I'm going to be keeping an eye on, because foundationally we all know what the Eagles want to do. Now we're going to see if they're able to go out there and execute it with more regularity like they did in 2024, because that Giants game was reminiscent, to me at least, of that 2024 offense where the Eagles were able to dictate whatever they wanted to do on that side of the ball. The linebacker situation is another storyline that I'll be keeping a close eye on. How are the Eagles going to distribute the snaps between Nakobe Dean and Jahad Campbell? For me, I think it could be matchup-based, because let's say a team like the Packers, well, they could spread you out, and you might need more athletes on the field who can help in coverage and the rangier type of players with that sideline-to-sideline cover ability, and that's where someone like Jahad Campbell, I think, would factor pretty heavily, I would imagine. But you have to find a role also for Nakobe Dean, because I don't think anyone will deny that when he's on the field, he brings juice. There's a noticeable swagger, a toughness, the tenacity, and it seems to resonate throughout the defense. And he's someone that Vic Fangio is very high on, and he should. He was an unsung hero last season. I just think that a lot of what the defense's mentality, their mindset, their focus, it was all derived from Nakobe Dean and his vision of what he expected that defense to be. So you have to find a role for him. Now, he played 33 snaps against the Giants, and Jahad Campbell played 21. You also have to take into account that they have enough edge rushers where he's likely going to be exclusively used as a linebacker. And I think to diminish his snaps or workload would be, hindering his progress, because when he's been playing off-ball linebacker, Jaire Campbell has made notable strides each and every week. So I think that it's again, we go back to that saying, it's a good problem to have. I think the Eagles will find their way, and it could be situational in how they do it, but both players need to be involved. Zach Bond obviously is not going to come off the field, but I think that the Eagles could strike a balance and find different ways to get Nakobe Dean and Jaire Campbell on the field. And now all of a sudden you're putting on tape something where teams are going to have to key in on. And I also look at that as the under center and the looks that we've seen, the Vikings game, the Giants game. That's something that even if it doesn't work, you're putting it on tape, and now teams have to account for that. They have to respect it. Kind of like the linebacker situation. You don't want to tip your hand too much, like in obvious run-down scenarios. You don't just want to have Nakobe Dean in there because you know what the Eagles are planning for. But I think that there is a role for both players and enough snaps to go around. Pass rush. We talked a little bit about it, but the reality is that the Eagles have an abundance of pass rushers now. But until they go out there on the field and prove it, on paper is all we have to go off of at the moment. But I do believe, and I went into the trade deadline believing with with a considerable conviction that edge rusher was their most significant need, and obviously the Eagles agreed with that. They swung big to add a player of the caliber of a Jaelan Phillips, and they added some corners as well, but I think pass rush here was an obvious need. Now, adding a player like Phillips, and you couple that with Brandon Graham and Nolan Smith potentially returning, J-Lux Hunt maybe seeing a reduction in snaps, and all of a sudden everyone's fresh. You're able to throw pass rushers at teams in waves, and that should, in theory, alleviate pressure on the back end. And then all of a sudden, that type of move is helping all three levels of the defense. That's the way that I'm sure the Eagles are envisioning it, even if they didn't get the prototypical cornerback 2. If they get passable play on the outside, that should be able to be sufficient enough if they can get some rush, if they can get consistent pressure from their edge rushers, which I have to believe that they should be able to do. By the way, Jaelan Phillips has 3 sacks this season, which is the combined total of the Eagles edge rushers this season through 8 games. Pretty crazy when you think of it and put it in those terms. But I think that the edge rusher situation is one to key in on, because if they're able to get some success, if they're able to get home, if they're able to pressures are just as valuable, because you're forcing quarterbacks to ramp up their processing, moving them off their spot, and maybe putting them in a scenario where they're fitting a ball in a tight window or making a hasty decision. That's something that I believe could help the secondary when you have a young player like a Drew Makuba or a revolving door at corner. I think pass rush is going to be critical, and that's what I'll be keying in on Monday night when the Eagles take on the Packers. I want to see what that rotation looks like. I want to see if they're able to confound Jordan Love or rush him through his process, because if they're able to do that, that could be the key in winning that football game right there. Finally, as we close things out, the cornerback 2 carousel. That's a storyline for many reasons, but because they've been toggling between so many different players, you would like to see the Eagles figure it out over the next couple of weeks based on what they're seeing in practice and in game situations, and land on a definitive option to start opposite Quinyon Mitchell. And then you have more stability, for one, but for communication purposes, for continuity purposes, I think that's something that would serve the defense well, instead of he's not playing well, let's put him in. Well, he gave up a big play, let's put him in. Or he's hurt, so we're going to go back to him. I just don't know that that's a long-term sustainable recipe for success, even if you are being able to generate pressure up front. I think ultimately it will be Jaire Alexander, assuming that he's able to rekindle some semblance of the player that he was even 3 years ago. But I think in the short term, it'll be Kelee Ringo. But the big wild card here to me is Jacorian Bennett. It's a storyline because they need to figure this out, and they're going to have to figure it out soon, with the Packers and the Lions on the slate coming up, and you don't want to be kind of in flux there at that position. But I believe that the Eagles have enough pieces there to figure it out, but I'm curious to see who emerges from the pack. I listed what I believe is going to happen. We'll see how that all shakes out, but it's going to be really interesting. Something to think about here. The Eagles have a huge game coming up on Monday night. This is sort of a preview, a lead-up leading into that, and appreciate all the feedback I've gotten on the podcast. It's we're already on episode 5, I believe, and the feedback's been tremendous. Want to get involved with some mailbag questions to get the listeners involved, and I also welcome any feedback that you may have. But for now, that's going to do it for this edition of Birds Buzz. I am Andrew DiCecco, and I will catch you on the next one. Hey guys, Andrew DiCecco here. Hope you enjoy Birds Buzz, and be sure to like and subscribe on YouTube. And if you liked Birds Buzz, check out our other videos on YouTube on the links right here.